Okay guys, what we're looking at here is the clutch casing for a BMW F650GS, which we're going to remove. Now the biggest problem facing the removal of this casing is this pipe down here, which runs around the outside and stops it from being pulled out. So I'm going to show you how to deal with that. Firstly, there's a few things we have to remove. The clutch cable needs to be disengaged from the actuation arm. We need to remove the gear lever and this foot peg. The gear lever uses a size 10 hexagonal bolt. The foot peg uses 3 Torx head screws size 40. Loosen those up, get the foot peg and the gear lever off, and we'll tackle the next step. Okay, so here we have our gear lever that has been removed. Don't forget that that bolt right there has to come out completely in order for it to slide off the shaft. There's a groove in the shaft in which that bolt sits, and unless you remove it completely, it's not going to slide out. So that's a small tip for that. Here is the foot peg that we removed, the 3 bolts that were holding it in place. And now what we're going to do is tackle the water pump housing. Now there are 3 bolts that hold it. I've already loosened them for time saving. So those are the 3 bolts. What's normally going to happen is a load of coolant is going to drip out at this point. So have a bucket or something handy underneath to catch the old coolant. And we're going to lift that up. It needs to be out of the way like that. So I've just prepared a bungee cord here, which is going to help me keep it up out of the way. Okay, that exposes our clutch casing and all the bolts that we need to get to in order to remove it. So what we're going to do is look at loosening this oil return line, which is a major obstacle in getting this casing off. One of the things we need to do is remove the oil return pipe from the little hose in the oil reservoir. Obviously before all of this you would have drained all the oil out by loosening that bolt there, loosening the oil reservoir there, and there are 2 pegs on that side there, all as per the service manual for draining the oil. So get the oil out, remove that pipe. If you go into the inside of the engine here, I already have a Torx screwdriver going into where the screw can be found. Don't know if you can see where it ends there. Just to the right of those 2 pipes, there's a little bracket that holds the pipe in place, and that screw can be a little tricky to get out. If you let it drop, it can be a little tricky to find, so be careful when removing it. Loosen that, and we're almost there. The last thing we'll need to do is get in under the engine, and as you can see there, the oil return pipe bolts on to the engine there. There's a copper washer above and below that fitting, which you need to be careful not to lose. So you loosen that, loosen the hose from the oil reservoir, and loosen that bolt in there, which you might be able to see from this angle. Not so easy, but when you start fiddling around with the line, you'll see the bracket that holds it in place. So I'm going to get busy loosening those things up, and then we'll look at how everything's going to come out. Okay, the next step we need to do is drop the exhaust, because if you look at where the oil return line sits, it gets wedged in between the casing and the exhaust, and although it's loose, there isn't much wiggle room because it bangs up against the exhaust. So the first thing we're going to do on the exhaust is loosen the joint where the back part of the exhaust joins the front, and you can do that by using a size 15 spanner. I recently did do some work where the exhaust was dropped, so I put some copper grease into the thread. So my job is going to be very easy, but you might find you'll have to spray it with some penetrating fluid, let it work right into the thread, and tackle it very slowly and gently. You don't want to strip the bolt and cause yourself extra work. Okay, so now our exhaust clamp is loose. You may need to pry it open with a couple of screwdrivers here to get it loose, but that'll just slide up now, out of the way, and reveal the joint where we're going to separate the exhaust. Now, in order to do that, we need to loosen the exhaust at the front where it comes out of the cylinder, right in there, and that uses 2 hexagonal 13mm bolts. I'm going to loosen those. Those 2 nuts from the exhaust are now off, and this little bracket will just simply slide off the exhaust, and all you need to do is gently ease it out of the cylinder, and the whole front part of the exhaust comes loose. Give it a little twist and it'll drop down just enough for you to get this oil line out. So we're going to loosen that and pull it out now. This is the nut that holds the oil return line to the bottom of the sump. You'll see on here I've left the 2 washers, 2 copper washers. One sits at the bottom against the head of the bolt, then the oil return line fitting goes in between, and then this one sits between the fitting and the sump. So I put them both on there for safekeeping. Now, final few things before we remove the cover. The clutch cable. That's going to clip off quite easily, just like that. You'll find that seal there against the gear selector is going to give you a little bit of resistance. So I've already loosened that up a little bit, and there we go. Be careful behind, in between the cover and the engine is a paper gasket. So if you're planning on reusing it, try not to use any sharp tools to pull this out. And as it comes out, you may need to give the oil line a bit of a wiggle. Have it. One clutch case removed, exposing clutch. Now, to remove the clutch plates, you're going to need a Torx head screw, size 30. I've already loosened these up a little bit in diagonally opposing order, just to keep the pressures even. Behind these screws are the clutch springs, so if they need replacing, very easy to just slot the new ones in. Once you remove the last of the clutch springs, that's what they look like. All these bits come out. This is the main plate which gets pulled by the clutch lever through these grooves and separates the friction plates from the pressure plates. And changing the friction plates on a clutch on a bike is one of the easiest things you can do. That's what the friction plate looks like. It's got an abrasive disc on the inside, and it alternates with these pressure plates. These are just metal discs. These never need replacing unless something really goes wrong. So they alternate like that. On this particular model there are 7 of each. So all you need to do is, once you've got all of these out, put them back in alternating order, and we start our reassembly then. Now that the springs and the new friction plates are in place, we can tighten up the whole lot. Obviously tightening a little as we go along in alternating order, so that the pressure is evenly tightened around the circumference of the clutch. And so forth, back to the top, tightening a little bit each time so that the clutch goes in nice and evenly and the pressure is applied evenly. Right, now that everything's back together, The main thing we need to make sure of is that these splines are facing right before we put the cover back on, because the rod on the inside of the cover that runs down the inside there has splines. It has to line up with this. If they're not lined up, you're going to cause some damage, and you're going to push this rod and the bearing behind it into the casing and have to reassemble it again. So let's see if we can get this on gently. Okay, here we go. Taking very gentle care with the paper gasket. Wiggle the casing in behind the oil line, and important note, get the oil line in just before the clutch casing goes in, because there's no space for the oil line to wedge in after that. So there we go. Now as it goes in, you will see the clutch rod should turn slightly when it catches the splines on the inside. Now a couple of little adjustments to make. There we go. Okay, it hasn't hit the splines yet. Just get these screws for the starter motor out of the way. Those are two screws I forgot to mention earlier that need to come out. They sit vertically into the clutch casing. They need to come out. That's the starter motor that bolts onto it there. Just going to move those out of the way for now. Got the oil line obstructing at the back. There we go. The oil line is over the clutch casing now. And that should all go home. Yeah, you can see the rod is catching on the splines now. Okay. Gentle persuasion does it. Okay, it's definitely lined up because the splines are working. You also have this water pump cog to line up onto the splines on the inside. There's a little bit of wiggling that needs to be done between the starter motor preventing entry on this side, the tight seal around the gear selector, the lining up of the splines, and just the general as it's going in, you can see this shaft turning. There we go. As it goes in, it tightens, which means that the splines have lined up. See it moving a bit more there. Alright, that's nearly completely in place. Maybe one final little click. There we go. And we have it. All the bolts that tighten the casing to the engine have been tightened, including these two bolts for the starter motor. So now what we need to do is get the oil line back on, which we will do by putting this bolt back. Don't forget about the second copper washer. One underneath, the other one goes in on top. Give it a few loose turns so that we can line up the rest of it, connect it up to the reservoir, and tighten that whole lot up. Now that the oil line is all tight in all three places, at the bottom, at that very hard to get to little screw, and back the hose back up in the oil reservoir, we can put the exhaust back in place. Now, between the exhaust and the cylinder, there's this little metal washer which has little tabs in. That's going to clip onto the exhaust, and it might be a good idea just to press the tabs in a tiny little bit so that they hold on the end of the exhaust. Just like that. It keeps itself in place. Now we can bring the tightening bracket back up, nice and gently, bring the exhaust back in. And in it goes. Bracket fits nicely back over the bolts, just like that. And we're ready to put the bolts back on and then tighten up the joint on the exhaust. Our exhaust is now firmly in place. Tighten the clamp there and onto the cylinder. Next thing is putting the water pump housing back in place. 3 simple little bolts. Make sure the gasket underneath, it's a little rubber gasket. Make sure it's nice and clean. Now that our casing is fully secured, we're ready to put our clutch fork back into place. Before we do that, it's a good idea to make sure that you have a little bit of play left on the clutch adjustment cable. I'll explain why in a second. How we do this is it's going to go in that way with the hooks like that, and what you want to do is make sure that the cable is fully pulled out on this end, and you're going to put the arm in such a way that it's slightly past the end of the lug, because there is a small bit of play in the initial movement of the arm. And what you want to do is, when you remove that play, you want this little lug to just be able to hook over so that there's no play in the cable when it's in position. And to get it in position, then simple vice grip on the clutch arm, give it a twist, and the cable will just slot right in, just like that. Now the reason why I've left a margin is because now that the cable is tense, it could be just enough to separate the friction plates from the pressure plates, so we want to be able to adjust it back a little if necessary. So screw back in to the clutch arm, and after this a few bits and pieces and we'll be ready for the road. Now the last few pieces remaining, we have our foot peg to put back in before the gear selector. The reason for that is, once you have the gear selector in, you want to be able to get to this bolt I'm currently putting in now. So the foot peg has that bolt and another 2 bolts that go in underneath. I'm going to tighten those and then put the gear selector on. With the foot peg now in place, I can get the gear selector on. Don't forget, bolt out. And once that is tightened, all we need to do is top up the oil and the coolant and hit the road.